Welcome to Out of the Box with Kermit Morris, a podcast dedicated to helping believers grow in their spiritual walk. Jesus wants us to look more and more like Him every day by getting out of our comfort zones. We hope this podcast will be a blessing to you as you learn to get out of your box and follow Christ. Now, here's our host, Kermit Morris.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Out of the Box with Kermit Morris. Today's episode's a little different. I want to tell my story. I want you to hear what God's done in my life and how He changed my life. We're going to start today with four key words. Four key words that will be this whole podcast. The first key word is that we tell my story and share with you what God did in my life and how He changed my life. I guess the first words that came to mind to me in this process was the word misconception. You see, as a child, I grew up in Northeast Louisiana. I went to church as a child. My mom was very much involved in church, and so I would attend church. The misconception that I had came from as a child, not understanding the things of God. Why did I go to church? Why did Mom make me go to church? I didn't understand what was happening in my life, but something was going on. About the time I was in the 5th grade, and I had attended the church and gone to Wednesday night services and played on the softball teams, I knew all of that was going on, but I didn't understand the concept about asking Christ into your life. I didn't understand what was going on in my life. I think it felt like, anyway, that I was the only person in my school that was not a Christian. I had, at 5 years old, not 5 years old, in the 5th grade, we had a record-breaking Sunday at First Baptist Church in Oak Grove, Louisiana. And that Sunday, my Sunday school teacher had a record that he was trying to not ever break. And it was called a record-breaking Sunday at the church. And everybody in that 5th grade class had always got saved on that Sunday. And it came that Sunday, and I didn't know anything about salvation. I didn't understand what was going on in my life at that time. And so when my class, it came to the church service, we all went down together to the front of the auditorium to be saved. Well, I had a preacher at that time that he looked at me and he said, "Why are you here?" And I said, "I came down because we wanted to break the record and not break the record and have somebody that got through this class without being saved." And the preacher was wise enough to talk to me one-on-one privately. And he determined that I did not get saved that day, that I'd gone down. And I'd said those words, "I give my heart to Christ," but he knew that I didn't understand what I was talking about. And so he was wise enough not to baptize me at that time. Well, during that time, I got to about the 7th grade, and I began work at the radio station part-time in town. It was a job that I enjoyed doing, and I had liked it, but I had a Sunday morning show. And every Sunday morning, the pastors in the area would come in and they'd preach a sermon, and they were outside in an area. I was in the control room, and they were in an area where they couldn't see me and I couldn't see them. I just had the controls to work to keep them on the air. And it was kind of funny to me. I didn't realize that I was being rude or anything, but I thought these guys were strange. And they were presenting what they call the gospel. And I didn't understand it. I didn't know what they were talking about. And so all through high school, from 7th grade through the 12th grade, I worked at our local radio station. Oak Grove, where I grew up, is a town of about, I'd say 1,800 at my years in high school. 1,800 people. And so it's a close-knit community, and it's a great community where you want to grow up. All of my friends that I knew were supposedly Christians, but I wasn't. But nobody ever told me how to be a Christian. Nobody ever shared that with me. When I was just 7 years old, my father passed away from a heart attack. And I grew up kind of an only child because all my brothers and sisters were older than me and graduated. And it's just me and Mom at home. And she would take me to church all the time, but I can never remember a time that someone told me what it was to be a Christian and what was a Christian. I didn't understand that. Finally, I graduated from high school, joined the Air Force, and I was away at a camp, a base that I was stationed at. And I was coming home. I had some leave time, and I wanted to come home. And so I came home. But before I did, I called a friend who lived there and said, I'm coming home this weekend, and this girl I've been dating, we hadn't got along very well, and I want to make her jealous. And so do you know somebody that we could fix me up with a date with? And she said, well, I've got somebody coming this weekend home with me from school. They were going to Louisiana Tech. And so I said, well, can you fix me up? And she said, sure. And she did. And so I had a blind date with this girl from Louisiana Tech that I didn't know. And so I got there, and I was blown away by her. And I took her to a football game at Northeast Louisiana State University at that time. And that was the name of it. And we went to a football game. And it was a great time, and I enjoyed myself so much that I don't know if I ever made my girlfriend jealous of the girl I wanted to date, but I didn't go back. And I began to date her, and I began to see something different in her life. And over the next year and a half, we dated long distance. I was stationed in San Antonio, and she lived in Shreveport, Louisiana. But every time I was around her, I noticed something different in her life. And one weekend I went up and stayed with her and her mom and dad and her sisters. And on the way back to San Antonio, I left on late Sunday afternoon. On the way back to San Antonio, God began to jump all over me. I didn't know what it was at first. And the more I listened and felt like somebody was talking to me, I realized years later that it was God that was talking to me. And for that long drive from Shreveport, Louisiana to San Antonio, Texas, God just really worked me over. So I got back to San Antonio and realized what it was that I had finally felt like I saw a Christian. Now, don't get me wrong. All of my friends in high school were Christian, but they were in the process of developing what that was in their life. Every one of them today is a strong Christian witness wherever they go and whatever they do. But I felt like this woman, this girl that I was dating, really put her faith out there. And whatever she had, I decided I wanted. And I wanted it to be part of my life. So I got back to San Antonio about 3 o'clock in the morning and drove into my barracks and got out and went in and came in. Everybody was asleep in the whole place that was there. And when I got there, I got to my bunk and immediately dropped to my knees right beside my bunk bed. And I began to say, God, I don't even know if you're real or not. But if you are, I want you to come into my life. That blind date, that was kind of the second thing in my conversion experience. Blind date, I saw a Christian, I felt like, for the first time. Actually, I hadn't. There were others, but I didn't know it. I couldn't recognize it. God took the scales off of my eyes, and I saw what a Christian was in this girl that I was dating. So the third word that came up in my mind as I was thinking about my life and my giving my life to Christ was discouragement. When we began to date and we decided to get married, well, about a month before we would get married, I've kind of had this strange feeling that I should not marry this Christian girl and not be a Christian also. I had given my life to Christ about a month before we were married, and I felt like I needed to follow up on that and be obedient to God by being baptized. I called my home in Oak Grove, Louisiana, and talked to the pastor and told him what was going on in my life. And he said, "When are you coming back home?" And I said, "In just a little while." And he said, "Well, let's talk when you get here." And so I did. I sat down and talked with him, and he began to tell me some things and tell me about how things fell into place and what things were going on. And I realized that I needed to follow Christ in baptism, in believer's baptism. And so I did. And then Henrietta and I got married right after that. And at the same time, the war was going on in Vietnam, and years earlier, I had made a commitment and went down and put in a volunteer statement to go to Vietnam. Now, you say right now, you must be crazy, and I was. I didn't know anything was going on. I wasn't a Christian when I put that volunteer statement in, but I was committed because I had to go. And right before Henrietta and I got married, I got orders to go to Vietnam. And we talked about it and said, do we want to postpone the wedding and wait until after I get home to be married? And she said, no, I want to get married before you leave. And so we went ahead and got married. Now, I'm a brand new Christian with a brand new wife, and I've got about 2.5 months of leave time before I leave for Vietnam. So we got married and spent a lot of time together in those times. And I left for Vietnam in February of 1968. It was a Tet Offensive was going on in Vietnam at the time. And so I was headed over there. Well, little did either one of us know. But that time we were off together, Henrietta got pregnant with our first child. Now, where does this discouragement come in? Well, I got to Vietnam, and I found a chaplain on base when I got there. And I went to him and I said, "Chaplain, I am a brand new Christian. I don't know anything. Can you help me?" And I'll never forget it. He looked at me and he said, "Son, I'm trying to get through this war just like you are. Do the best you can." I did not grow an inch in that time in Vietnam. Not at all. In fact, I became bitter. While I was there, I had a brand new wife at home that I was missing terribly. They jumped all over me because I was overweight. And so I was very discouraged. And I had no growth in my life. Well, I came home from Vietnam to a brand new baby that I'd never seen before, to a wife that I'd barely known, and we had some difficult times. We struggled in that whole process when I got home from Vietnam. I was mad at the government because I didn't want to go, even though I volunteered. I was mad at God, even though I didn't know much about him. And I was mad at everything. So I got home from Vietnam and for a day or two rejoiced in the brand new baby girl that we had and my wife, spending that time with her. And I knew that I was wrong in my thinking, but that thinking began to produce results. And I was so angry that I didn't even want to go to church. And Henrietta would dress Denise every Sunday morning and would come in with her and sit on the edge of the bed and cry because I would not get up and go to church. I still had these feelings I had to sort out and I had to deal with. but I didn't know what it was at that time. And so I would sit there and just pretend to be asleep sometimes. Sometimes I wouldn't respond to her. I was just miserable in every possible way. But she was faithful to God and left every Sunday morning with me in bed and her crying as she went out the door to go to church, because that's who she was. That's her feelings for God. And I wouldn't go with her, the man that she loved at that point. So discouragement was there. It was real before I started to grow as a Christian. I began to go to church. One Sunday morning, I decided that today was the time that I was going to go. And she started in there crying and saying, "Come on and go with me." And I said, okay, and got up and got dressed and went. I think she must have been floored that I went. But I went. Years later, before I get to that, let me tell you, that first Sunday there, I had the dreaded scare that every new Christian ever has. We went Sunday morning, went back Sunday night, and Sunday night, that preacher, he had met me a time or two, but I'd never been to his church. And he said, I'm going to call on Kermit Morris to pray tonight. And I thought, what is that? How do I do that? Everybody's listening to me, and I don't know what to say. And I still don't know what I said that night, but I said something. But let me tell you, from that day on, every time I was in that church, I began to grow more and more in my image of who God was and what I needed to do and what I needed to look like. I saw the growth taking place in my life more than I even realized that it was. When I started into church and I got around church people, God began to work in my life. And he began to sort out some things and I began to see what God was about and who God is and how God has every aspect of our life covered. It wasn't even a year of doing that when I knew that God was calling me into ministry. I had just re-enlisted for another 4 years in the Air Force, and I knew that I was supposed to get out as soon as I could and go to school. I began to see growth taking place. I began to be around people that helped me grow. And that's part of the reason we have this podcast today, a podcast dedicated to help Christians grow in their Christian walk, because we don't fully realize the potential we have, the environment we're in, the things we can change about us and around us to do what God wants done. See, we're capable of doing nothing on our own, but we're capable of doing anything when God works through us. And I began to see that, and I began to succumb to that, giving God really control of my life and whatever he wanted and wherever he wanted me to go, whatever he wanted me to do. And some of the greatest adventures of my life have been because God was in control. I gave him my life, and I gave him the opportunity to interrupt my life anytime he wanted to, because my life belonged to him. And over the years, God has grown me spiritually more and more every day, because you see, I realized we never grow up in God. We're always on the grow, always trying to get better and better, always trying to look more like Jesus himself, because that's his goal for us. That's what he wants us to do, is to become an image of him in our lives. And so we begin to grow and we begin to see things happen in our lives. God had called me into ministry. I didn't know what that would involve. I thought I was going to be a minister of recreation in the church for the rest of my life. That didn't last long. God began to move me from this position to this position to this position, helping me to grow more and more. He sent me around the country. We lived in 9 different states during that time. And every state was another growth adventure for us in our lives spiritually and together. He sent us to Germany for 3 years, where we had to depend on each other and God alone in order for us to grow, because we were away from family for the first time in our lives. We had the call of God on our lives, and we had the starting of an adventure that's been a great adventure as we've been, like I said, to every state. We lived in 9 different ones, but we've been to every state in the Union except North and South Dakota. We've been to many different countries where we've ministered in those countries. We lived in some countries. We even went to England and pastored a church. But the greatest adventure of our life was that day I decided to give my life to Christ. And then the next chapter of that was when God called me into ministry and said, "You are going to be mine. Whatever I want you to do, you'll do." I tell you, I could not be happier to know that God is in control of my life and leads me wherever He wants me to go. It's exciting to be in the will of God. It's exciting to face obstacles in your life. You see, God really grows us when we give our life to Him. God really grows us as He puts pressure on us to do certain things that take us out of our comfort zone, where we have to depend on Him to get it done. That's why we have Out of the Box with Kermit Morris. That's why I'm so excited to call God my Father, my leader, the one I worship, the one I love. That's this session of Out of the Box with Kermit Morris. We're glad you joined us today. Maybe some other day we'll talk some more about some of the adventures that God has put us on. Join us again next week. Hopefully next week we're doing an interview with a pastor about spiritual growth and how you and I can grow even more in the Lord. You see, we will be growing until the time we get to heaven to spend it with Jesus. We won't need to grow anymore. Jesus tells us in His Word that we'll be perfect then. But until then, He wants us to look more and more like Him every day. You can do that by listening to this program, by reading your Bible, by putting yourself out there in situations where you have to depend on God and God alone to do what Jesus wants you to do. I love you, and thank you for listening to Out of the Box with Kermit Morris. We'll see you next week.